friends, today we are going to be taking a look at some of the things that we should remember when we are reading a fiction story or a story that is made up. So all stories that are fiction have what we call the story structure, and stories usually have a similar structure. Authors organize the plot in a way that will entertain readers. So what we see is sort of like this roller coaster that we see on our screen. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to a story. In the beginning, the events include the conflict or the problem that the characters face. In the middle, we see the characters trying to solve the conflict. And in the end, we see the resolution or how the characters solve the conflict. And what we should be doing as we are reading the story and getting into that middle is be looking for evidence or clues in the text to describe the story's plot. And the story's plot is exactly what's happening in the story. Now, when we're reading a story, we should be asking and answering questions. And we should do this before we read, during reading, and after reading. So why should we do this? First of all, we want to get information. Next, it helps us understand the text. We do it so that we can practice being awake and thinking while we're reading. And we want to be curious and wonder when we read. So how do we do this? Well, we use question words to ask who, what, where, why, when, and how. And we look around in the text and pictures for that evidence or details to help us answer those questions. So one of the things that we talk about when we are reading is that we want to monitor and clarify. And the way that we do this is we pay attention when we read. If something doesn't make sense, we want to try these things to help us to understand. So these are some little tips. First of all, we can reread the part of the text that we don't understand. We can use what we already know to connect to the text. We can think to ourselves, this part reminds me of, and you're thinking of something that you already know. You can use visual clues, like you can look at headings or captions or pictures or special parts of the type to kind of give us an idea of maybe what's going on. And in a work of fiction, we definitely are going to be using those pictures, right? Because that's where we're going to see lots of clues as to what the plot is. Then we want to ask questions. We want to think to ourselves, what was that paragraph mostly about? So sometimes we need to reread it and reread it again so that we can answer that question. And then we might want to think to ourselves, I wonder why the main character said that. So these are some of the ways that we can monitor and clarify text. Another way we can do this is to create mental images. Now, mental is inside of our brains, right? And when we create mental images, we make pictures in our mind to help us to remember what we read. So what are some of the things that we are looking for? Well, we can make mental images by looking at the pictures, reading sounds, thinking about tastes, thinking about smells. So, like for example, if we're looking at this picture, we might have read words from the text like soccer game, sunny, ball. And in our brains, we might be making this mental picture or this mental image of what this might be like to be at a soccer game. We might think of what that smells like, what that sounds like, maybe even what that tastes like based on if maybe we get a snack when we go to a soccer game. Maybe the cheers of the crowd. All the different things that help us to really envision what it is that we're reading. So a really important thing that we need to keep in mind when we are reading fiction is the setting. And that is what tells us where the story happens and when the story takes place. So we should ask ourselves, why is the setting important to this story? And this is going to give us a clue as to what the story is all about. When we're reading, we want to make connections. We want to find ways that the text is like things in our own life and to other texts that we have already read. So it starts here. This is what we need to do. First, we need to think about ourselves. And when we read, we want to connect the text to ourselves. So you're going to want to think, this reminds me of when and then think about something in your life that you have done that maybe you can relate to what is happening in the story with the main character. Another connection we can make is text to text. And that is when you think to yourself, this is like another book that I read. So maybe you might be reading one book and it reminds you of something that happened in another story. And then finally, we want to connect text to the world. And this is a big one. This is when we think about things that are happening in our community, in our world, and think about how some story that we read maybe connects with something that does actually happen in real life. So as we're reading, we want to make and confirm predictions. So this goes back to the asking the questions, right? The ones that we ask before we read, during, and then after we read. So before we read, we want to make a guess or a prediction about what the text is going to be about. And then we're going to want to find evidence to help us make that prediction. Use what we know about text features, about the genre, and about the structure of the text. So in your brain, you would be thinking, I think blank might happen because blank, and you would fill in those blanks. Now, as you read, you want to stop and think about your prediction. So you don't want to just plow through your reading. You want to stop every now and again, and you want to think about the prediction that you had. And you want to find out, you want to decide, was my prediction correct? If you answer yes to this question, then you confirmed your prediction and you should keep reading. But if you answered no to this question, then you might want to adjust or change your prediction or make a new one. Then you keep reading from there. So this brings us back to that story structure, right? The beginning, the middle, and the end. And we're looking at evidence throughout our whole story that's going to remind us of what this story is all about. And this is so very important because after we read a story, we want to be able to retell it and to other people so that we can share what we've read. And so how we do that is when we retell, we describe what happens in a story in order. Okay, so very important. We want to make sure that we do it in order. So many times I have friends who will tell me about a story that they read, but they may not tell it to me in order. And that makes it harder for me to understand what the story was about. So we want to use some key words as we retell our story. So we'll start with the word first. First, this happens. This tells us about the beginning of the story. Then we want to use some connecting words like next or then to tell us about the middle of the story. And then finally we would say last or lastly, and we get to the end of the story, and that's where we wrap it all up. Now you can see here that it says that we've got some tips, and these tips are really important, okay? So here we go. Tip number 1, use your own words. We don't need you to read the story back to us with the book in front of you. We want to hear from you. What did you learn from this story? What was your takeaway? What do you remember about what the story was about? And how are you going to do that? Use details from the story. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 2 is use details from the story in order to help support the retelling that you are doing. And then finally, if you want to refer back to things that happen, go ahead and show us pictures. As you're telling us this story, you can say, look right here. This is what happened right here. So you can use those pictures and those words to help remind you. So that's one way of talking about a story, is to retell the story. Another way is to summarize a story. Now, when we summarize, we're going to do this in a little bit of a shorter way. So when we retell, we're talking a little bit more, or we're writing a little bit more, right? But when we summarize, we're going to put the author's main ideas, the big ideas, into our own words. So how should we do this? So step number 1, read part of the text. Step number 2, stop and think about the most important ideas. Then say them in your own words. And then repeat for the next part. And then finally, at the end, put it all together, but say the most important ideas in only a few sentences. Okay, so let me say that again. You ready? We're going to say the most important ideas in only a few sentences. So a few sentences is like 3. Okay, so that's really hard, right? Because when we read a good story that we love, we want to tell about the whole thing. And that's kind of like the retell thing. But when we summarize, we're going to do it in just a few sentences. So just like 3 sentences. So we have to think about the most important parts. So a couple of tips here. Use important details. Use words from pictures and the text. And don't change the meaning of what those words are or what the story is about. Make sure you stick to what it is you read. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to remind you about what you should do when you read fiction. But I'm going to add one final thing here, and that is enjoy it. Fiction is so much fun. Stories are so much fun to read. So grab a great book, enjoy it, go through it, relate to those characters, be able to tell us about it. We can't wait to hear about the next book that you read. Bye, guys.